Greetings everyone and welcome back for another video. My name is Kara and welcome to Releasing Grief. Today we are going to go over the 16 types of grief. Yes, there are 16 types of grief and I am going to go through each one and give you a brief definition of what it means so that maybe it will help you identify some of the things that are going on with your grief. And it doesn't just have to be one. There can be more than one that you have going on, but this is to educate you and try to give you an idea of what you may be feeling. I'm also going to leave the link for this image below. You may want to screenshot it, share it, and keep it for your reference in the future. Okay, so let's get started. Number one, normal grief. The emotional distress that accompanies a trauma. 2, complicated grief. The type of grief that worsens over time. 3, traumatic grief. The grief that you feel after the sudden or unexpected loss of a loved one. 4, chronic grief. A grief that does not subside. 5, anticipatory grief. The grief that you feel when you are waiting for a loved one to pass away. This is very common when we are dealing with someone who has a terminal illness. Number 6, disenfranchised grief. Deep grief you feel over the loss of a relationship that is outside the typical family structure or other recognized relationships. And a good example of this is if your favorite celebrity or actor were to pass away and you would feel grief from that. Number 7, distorted grief may give you the feelings of guilt or anger. This typically happens when someone has survivor's guilt. So, for example, if you were in a situation like a car accident and you were the survivor of the car accident and the other victims passed away, this would be a great example of distorted grief. Number 8, exaggerated grief. Start out as normal grief, but grows with intensity as time passes. So, for exaggerated grief, often grief stems from an attachment to someone. So, you could be young and married to someone and they pass away. Well, you're going to have exaggerated grief because all the hopes and dreams of things that you would do together have been taken from you. Also, grieving the loss of a child because as each milestone occurs, when the child was going to go to school or graduate or go to college, your grief can be exaggerated by that. These are just a couple of examples, but it applies to a lot of different things. Number 9 is mass grief. When you've experienced grief and may not even be aware that symptoms such as anger or impulsive behavior are related to a loss. Mass grief can also be related to taking on drug use or alcoholism as a result of grieving. Number 10, inhibited grief can manifest in the form of chronic headaches, stomach pains, or even muscle and body aches. And this is common when people suppress their grief because they hold it in, so internally their body is breaking down. Number 11, collective grief. When grief affects a whole community, city, country, or even the world. This can be common when we have the death of a president or a former president. Number 12, cumulative grief. When a current loss may dredge up feelings of loss you have suffered in the past. So this is when you kind of associate your grief with something else. Say if you lose one parent and then a few years later you lose the other parent. That's a very unfortunate situation to be in, and it can cause cumulative grief. Number 13, prolonged grief. When normal grief lasts for 12 months or longer, and that is not unusual, especially if you go back to when we talked about exaggerated grief, prolonged grief, as you can see, they can couple and pair with more than one term. Number 14, abbreviated grief. A short-lived but bona fide grief. So it hits you pretty hard, but you're able to quickly move on. Number 15 is delayed grief, when your grief may be postponed for a matter of weeks, months, and sometimes years. This is common for a person who maybe they're in charge of arranging the memorial service and they just have to prioritize something else first. This also can be common with people who lose children because they may have other children to take care of and they can't stop and properly go through the grieving process because life stops when you're grieving, but it also is still moving very fast. So these are some of the effects that happen when you have to go into a delayed grieving process. Number 16 is absent grief, when you may show few or no signs of grieving. This is common if you didn't experience grief initially. That is not something to feel guilty about. Some people go into shock, some people are numb, some people, their brain just can't process the loss. And so the grief seems absent, but it's not absent. It just hasn't surfaced with the person as of yet. So thank you for watching. Again, I'm going to link it below if you want to save it for your reference. Thank you.